The film starts by showing Drew, a skinwalker who has just taken the body of Emily Roberts. After Drew takes the body of his victims, they turn into a rotten corpse. Drew then disposes of the body of Emily Roberts, and he begins to act like the real her. Drew goes back to Emily Roberts' house and her boyfriend tries to inform the police that she is back. Personally, Drew doesn't want anything to do with the police because of her notorious activities, so he kills Emily's boyfriend. A few moments later, he discovers rots coming out from Emily's body. When Drew was younger, he spent up to a year in people's bodies. Now everything is speeding up, and he barely has 6 hours to spend with his hosts. Anyways, survival has been Drew's main concern, and he will do anything to survive. However, a police officer comes knocking on the door, and when Drew opens the door, the detective sees Emily Roberts. The detective asks about her boyfriend James, who has previously reported to them when she went missing. The detective eventually enters the house and Drew makes him feel at home. The detective starts to interrogate Emily. Drew gets bored, and he decides to take the detective's body. After he takes his body, he sets Detective Freddie Ransom's rotten body on fire. He then leaves the house. Thanks to Detective Freddie's memories, Drew learns that Freddie used to deal with bad guys who sell drugs and he drives to them. He gets a drug from one of the guys Freddie was friends with, and he sniffed the drug to get better. He then enters a bar where he meets Julia, and he says all sorts of sweet words to her. Drew gets along with Julia, and they eventually start kissing each other. Suddenly, Drew begins to feel pains in his body, and he discards Julia with immediate effect so that he won't have to take her body. The pain gets worse, and Drew finally sees a man and woman talking in a car. He orders the woman to go home. Though it wasn't his intention to kill the man and take his body, that is just what he does for survival. He takes the body of this innocent middle-aged man and pretends to be him, and he goes to his family. When he gets to his house, he begins to act weird. He then leaves for work the next day. He pretends to be Dr. Sam, and he does the dentist work perfectly as he has all Dr. Sam memories. After work, he goes to eat in a restaurant where he accidentally sees Julia walk by. He runs out of the restaurant, but he loses Julia eventually. Later that night, he goes to the usual bar, and then luckily for him, Julia comes in as well. Julia sees a different person. The last Drew that Julia saw was a detective. Now Drew is a middle-aged man. Drew engages her in a conversation, and Julia ends up telling Drew her story. After some time, Drew goes to the restroom, and he discovers that the rots are back again. He then leaves the bar without further discussion with Julia. He starts to sniff coke to relieve himself, but it doesn't get any better. He finally reaches out to the lady he saw Dr. Sam with the other night to come over to his place. When the lady, Rachel, gets to his house, Drew takes her body too. Drew then goes to the same bar because Drew knows Julia will be there. Julia has met Detective Freddie and the middle-aged man Sam, but she never knew they were the same person. Drew walks up to her in Rachel's body, and he makes friends with Julia. Julia, being a nice person, gets well with her. As Rachel talks to Julia, a guy walks to them, and Julia excuses herself. Drew doesn't like this guy's company, but he plays along. Later, he leaves the bar with this guy, and they begin to make love. However, due to this guy's attitude, Drew is forced to kill him. Drew and Rachel's body runs away while the police trace her. She eventually hides away from them, and they lose her. The next morning, Rachel's boyfriend discovers her exact location, and he pulls up to her there. Rachel hits him, and she runs away. However, Drew sees Julia with a man and he stalks them. Drew's situation in Rachel's body starts to get worse, and he eventually tracks down the man Julia was talking to, and he takes his body. Now in Robert's body, Drew decides to call Julia to go over to her place. Julia knows Robert to be a loving friend, and maybe they have something coming. Julia doesn't hesitate to accept Robert's invitation. When Drew gets to Julia's place, they begin to romance, and it leads to sex. Roberts then goes back to his house, and he discovers Rachel's corpse to be smelling all over the place. He disposes of Rachel's body, and he continues his love with Julia. However, Julia watches the news of people's deaths at Robert's house. The news broadcasts about Farm of Death, which is Drew's doings. When Drew enters the living room, he quickly diverts Julia's attention from the TV, enters the restroom afterwards, and his crazy pain starts. He groans and Julia tries to know what's going on with him. This time around, Drew couldn't help it but tell Julia about everything. He sounds crazy to Julia. None of what he says makes any sense to Julia. But it gets tense, especially when Drew starts to talk about the people he has taken their bodies. Julia removes an electrocuting device from her bag, and she begins to hit Drew. Drew tries to stop her, but in the end, he takes her body. Now in Julia's body, Drew cries for his love ending up that way. Drew goes back to the bar, and he drinks with a heavy and sad heart. Drew gives up on everything, and he allows himself to die. Drew thought he would die, but he comes back alive as an old man.